وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه والتابعين لهم بإحسان وهدى إلى يوم الدين. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. Alhamdulillah. In our sessions on the calls to the believers in the Noble Qur'an, we've reached the longest verse in the Qur'an, the 282nd verse of the Qur'an, which is known as Ayatul Mudayana, the verse on debts. And verse is a call to the believers, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala opens the verse by saying, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu, O you who believe, إذا تداينتم بدين إلى أجل مسمى فاكتبوه. If you enter into a debt to a specified term, then record it. وَلْيَكْتُبْ بَيْنَكُمْ كَاتِبٌ بِالْعَدْلِ. And let a scribe record the transaction between the two of you in a just manner. وَلَا يَأْبَ كَاتِبٌ أَنْ يَكْتُبَ كَمَا عَلَّمَهُ اللَّهُ. And let no scribe refuse to write as Allah has taught them. فَلْيَكْتُبْ. So let the scribe write. وَلْيُمْلِلِ الَّذِي عَلَيْهِ الْحَقِّ. And let the one upon whom the right is due mention the terms. وَلْيَتَّقِ اللَّهَ رَبَّهُ. وَلْيَتَّقِ اللَّهَ رَبَّهُ. And let him be mindful of Allah, his Lord. وَلَا يَبْخَسْ مِنْهُ شَيْئًا. And do not leave out or omit anything. And then the verses continue about what if one of the two parties is lacking in capacity. What if, and there's also in the verse the encouragement to have witnesses to that debt transaction. وَاسْتَشْهِدُوا شَهِيدَيْنِ مِنْ رِجَالِكُمْ. And seek the witness of two witnesses from amongst your men. And then the verses continue with other aspects of transaction. So this is the lengthiest verse of the Qur'an, verse 282. And you would think that the Qur'an, being a book of guidance, might have made the longest verse a verse about belief in Allah, or matters of the hereafter, or particular spiritual practices or acts of devotion. But it is noteworthy that the longest single verse of the Qur'an is on sound transaction. And verse 283 completes the message of the verse. Throughout the verse, as the commands are given, the details of how to go about transacting, and what if the person is here the translation says feeble-minded, but safihan, someone who is deficient in their ability to transact, and because who's lacking capacity for right judgment, or weak, then these contingencies are mentioned. But throughout that, there are reminders of taqwa, reminders of Allah's favor, right? That the scribe should not refuse, because they should write as Allah has taught them, because that blessing is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the one who's in debt, they should mention the terms by which they're taking the debt, for example, and let them be mindful of Allah, their Lord. Right? And Rabbahu their caring Lord, right? Their cherishing Lord, their sustaining Lord, the one who has granted you what you have. So this is a regular reminder, which meant, and the verse closes again with a call to taqwa. وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ وَيُعَلِّمُكُمُ اللَّهُ. And be mindful of Allah, and Allah will teach you. وَاللَّهُ بِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ عَلِيمٌ. And Allah has full knowledge of everything. So there's a few key aspects here with respect to what faith entails. One, that guidance is not complete simply by certain devotional acts or certain personal acts of good, but rather guidance is one's guidedness is sound when one is in a state of obedience to Allah in all one's affairs, and in all different aspects of one's life, not merely some rather than others. And that given the number of reminders of taqwa and consciousness of Allah in this verse, we also see that taqwa is tested in your transactions, in your dealings. And that's a test of both taqwa and of your awareness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As one of the scholars said, don't limit Allah to your prayer rug. Don't limit Allah to your prayer rug. That on your prayer rug, when you're sitting in dhikr or recitation of Qur'an, you're a righteous believer, but when you're in the marketplace, you're not. Rather, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in Surah An-Nur, in the verse known as the verse of light, Ayat An-Nur, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, رِجَالٌ لَا تُلْهِيهِمْ تِجَارَةٌ وَلَا بَيْعٌ عَنْ ذِكْرِ اللَّهِ. Accomplished ones, true men. Right? But it's not referring to the men as a gender, but truly accomplished ones whom neither trade nor transaction distract from the remembrance of Allah and establishing prayer, etc. Why? That in their trade and their transaction, in their work and their dealings, they're in a state of obedience to Allah and consciousness to Allah, or consciousness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So again, there's a lot of fiqh and a lot of legal guidance in this verse. We won't try to cover all of it, but take some of the key points. The first is that these verses are right after the verse of debt. Ayat al-Mudayana is right after the verses on riba. The verses on riba, on the prohibition, warning, and harm of usury and desisting from it, are verses 275 to 281 of Surah Al-Baqarah. Immediately thereafter, there is this call, verse 282, on right dealing, on one aspect of right dealing and its derivative implications. That if you enter into a transaction of debt, then write it down. We know from many verses of the Qur'an that while there's a general principle highlighted in the verses on riba, that وَأَحَلَّ اللَّهُ الْبَيْعَ وَحَرَّمَ الرِّبَى, that Allah has made transaction, trade permissible. Buying and selling, bay', trade, transaction, He has made it permissible. But this is not an absolute permissibility, it is a general permissibility that is conditioned. أَحَلَّ اللَّهُ الْبَيْعَ وَحَرَّمَ الرِّبَى, and has made riba impermissible. And riba is something that arises out of trade. Right? So that, yes, there's a general permission to trade, to transact, but it is not an absolute permission. Rather, there are particular matters that are prohibited. One thing to note, that when there's a general matter in which an exception is mentioned, then we know from that that other exceptions may well be possible. But it's the onus is on the one responsible to find out what the relevant exceptions are in one's circumstance. So أحل الله البيع وحرم الربا. And yes, Allah has permitted trade and prohibited riba, which is a type of transaction. So from that, anyone who would pause to reflect would understand that, well, there must be some meaning, direct meaning for which riba is prohibited. That meaning may be found in other things. There's a specific meaning, but there may be a general meaning in riba, which is harm, right? Injustice, that may be found in riba, that may be found in other things as well. So those other things may also be prohibited. So, and of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us a whole number of considerations in trade. And the key principles of right transaction are highlighted in the Qur'an. In Surah An-Nisa, the governing principle is given that affects even and highlights why we write down transactions, which is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that لا تأكلوا أموالكم بينكم بالباطل. Do not consume each other's wealth in wrongful ways. إلا أن تكون تجارة عن تراض منكم. Except if it is through trade on the basis of clear mutual agreement between the two of you, between you. So that, and that's basically summarizes all of commercial law, all of financial dealings. They do not consume one another's wealth in wrongful ways, except if it's through trade on the basis of clear mutual agreement between you. So if there is clear mutual agreement established at the point of transaction, and established such that dispute is not reasonable nor likely to arise consequent to the transaction, then it is a permissible, wholesome transaction. Whereas if that clear agreement, clearly established agreement between the two parties, both are clear on the terms of the transaction, and the agreement is such that it is not reasonable nor likely to result in dispute, if that's not the case, but rather there's elements of non-definition, or things may be defined, but people have selective memories. Like Brazil will be hoping for today, right? That they might forget sooner rather than later. But people forget. They say, no, I thought you gave me 2 years to pay it back. I said, no, I said 1 year. And even though there may have been agreement at the point of transaction, but that agreement could become fuzzy later. Which is why writing down a transaction, such as a debt or any other financing in which a debt or an obligation arises, the ruling in general is that it's generally recommended. This command here is what's called Amru Irshad. It's a command for guiding. It's a command for guiding and encouraging right action. It is not absolute. Why? Because in some cases there may be hardship in writing it down. Imagine if Uncle Jamil and Zubaydah had agreed that she marry Bilal. But then Umar Jafar came and grabbed Zubayr and said, go talk to Uncle Jamil. There's no way you can let her marry Bilal. She'll be miserable, you'll be miserable, and derivative misery, Bilal will be miserable. So Umar, the sincere friend, grabs them, stops the caravan on the way, and Uncle Jamil is very pragmatic. Said, look, I don't care who she marries as long as she gets married. So, and I don't want to embarrass people, so you better be able to pay a $10,000 mahr. And we're almost at the wedding hall, we're already 2 hours late. You know, they're originally Indian, so that's how we do things. Well, that's how some of our people do things. So, you better pay the mahr, you better be up to it right now and pay the mahr. We'll get rid of Bilal. And Uncle Jamil was a bit of a gangster, so they got diverted Bilal. So the whole community was there, so it won't make that much of a difference. But now, Zubayr needs $10,000. He said, cash up front. So Umar says, let's call Auntie Huda, wealthy auntie. So went to Auntie Huda, said, I need $10,000 cash up front. He says, okay, let's write it down. So no, you know, I'm going to miss out if this happens. So no, but we need 2 witnesses as well. You know, in some cases it could be difficult, awkward. So it's, as long as there wouldn't be dispute, etc. Yeah, there's many cases where it's not needed. But when the amount is significant, and $10,000 is significant for most people, it is particularly emphasized. But the sunnah would apply even if it's any amount of reasonable consideration. Any amount of reasonable consideration. Because disputes can arise from unexpected places. Someone's having a bad day and they get upset. You know, you borrowed $5 and you never gave them back. That person, I don't remember. And it becomes a dispute, and these things happen more often than we imagine. And I learned it the hard way. I was once just at a lunch at a friend's house, and I'd once borrowed $5 from this guy, and then I hadn't seen him around. So I hadn't really forgotten, but didn't have any, it wasn't urgent. So like a week or 2 had passed, and in the middle of the guy said, you know, why are you talking about all this stuff when you don't even pay people back? And it was a bit of a scene. I apologized, he didn't accept the apology. It was pretty colorful. So I learned a good lesson from that. But particularly when it is significant. And the significance is not always just material. Sometimes the significance is because something is important to you. Such a, you know, I have volume 30 of Tafsir Ibn Ashur of a friend of mine in Jordan. And I don't know how I have it. And now that one volume on its own is worth just like $7. But where you go, he got a 30th volume. He said he didn't need it anymore. But someone by mistake put it in my shipping and it came to Canada. I'd borrowed that. I wanted to look up something in the final juz of the Qur'an from Tafsir ibn Ashur. So, you know, one volume may not materially be worth that much, but it's significant because if you lose it, you might not be able to find an alternative. Like, you know, you can't normally buy individual volumes of a large volume collection. Or it could be significant because of some emotional connection you have with the thing. It was gifted to you by someone. Or it's of particular benefit to you. So, anytime there's significance to the matter, one should write it down. Or when there's relevant terms. There's relevant terms that people might forget. So it's best to write those down. So this is a good practice. And it doesn't have to be legalistic. Just I, Faraz Rabbani, have borrowed you have $250,000 from Umar Jafar, repayable on such and such date. And if there's any other terms, but just a basic thing. If you can get two witnesses, that's better, as we'll see. So this applies not just to debts, also transactions. It is shocking the number of times people get into employment contracts and they don't actually have a written contract. Happens all the time with startups. And then there's understandings. I understood that I'd have some shares in the company. How many? I don't recall, because they never agreed to it. And all kinds of arguments happen like that. Relationships are broken. And it's not just the material damage, but the human damage of relationships and loss of trust and so on. So when in doubt, one should write things. And then it says to a stated term. Right? So you enter into a debt to a stated term. And this is one of the important aspects of that clarity and definition. That if something is deferred, you should define till when it is deferred. Because otherwise it can lead to dispute. The one who borrowed would like a longer term. The one who lent wants a shorter term. Their interests are in conflict with each other. And unless there's definition, conflict should be expected. And sometimes people say one should never speak ill of Muslims, right? Especially as a blanket statement. The Prophet ﷺ warned, "Man qala halaka an-nas fahuwa ahlakuhum." Whoever says the people are all ruined is the most ruined of them. And they say this applies a fortiori to Muslims, but it applies in general. Man qala halaka an-nas, that there's no good people. Don't you can't trust people anymore, etc. One, it's a lie, because even if you can trust one person, what you've said is not true. Right? So one shouldn't generalize. Number two, one shouldn't, one should be careful. And when one's words are as it were a dua. Right? So if you want people to be rectified, say, oh Allah, rectify my state and the state of others. You want good for them. Putting people down is not from the sunnah. So people say, well, the worst people to deal with are Muslims. But it's not the problem that they're Muslim. The problem is that when we transact amongst each other, we don't have clarity and definition. You'd never leave your car at Canadian Tire to get some repairs and say, well, fix whatever there is and we'll figure out the bill later. Actually, by law, you can't do that. There's laws against that, at least in this country. They're not allowed to fix anything without telling you what it is and how much it would be and how needed it is. Which is not the case in every country. I made money in Jordan by frying a fax machine. I bought this fax machine. I had it sent. We had an office for Wakil Books, which I was a co-founder of, chief destructor. And I fried, I think, 4 or 5 devices in Jordan, because 220 and 110 volt. So I plugged it in, it blew up. So what do we do? I said, well, a friend of mine was there, said, let's go and get it repaired. I said, but let's see if it's worth repairing, because it was only this is right when fax machines were kind of going out of existence. So like $100, $120 fax machine. So if it's going to cost too much, we might as well get a new one. So you want to emphasize that no, just tell us, just look at it. If you want to charge for looking at it, we'll pay you. And don't repair anything. Call us. He fixed it. And said the bill was the equivalent of $250. And the whole thing was $120. I said, really? So we ended up selling it to him for I think like $175. It was a model that was apparently popular, it was Canon or whatever, some funny reason. So you end up making $50 on blowing up a machine. But these things, in some parts of the world, it's not that they're Muslim. The problem is that if you don't follow the right steps, the right results should not be expected. So there's a call here in that if a debt arises in a transaction, then record it to a stated term, right? That you have clarity and definition of the terms of a transaction. Anything that could lead to dispute, if not defined, makes that transaction corrupt, fasid, and it's sinful. They say كل جهالة تفضي إلى المنازعة تفسد العقد. Every non-definition that can lead to dispute corrupts the transaction. Corrupts, it's fasid, meaning that though valid, it is unsound and sinful and obligatory to either rectify or annul. To rectify or cancel. So it's a very serious matter. So we can incur sin by buying and selling, even though we're not buying and selling anything haram. For example, if I sold this table to Sister Lubna, so I sell you this table. She says, I accept. She says, I'll pick it up tomorrow. So, okay. Both of us just committed a sin. What's the sin? We didn't set the price. Doesn't seem like a big deal. But what could happen? Maybe I really like this table. So I thought, this table, and my wife bought it for the hub, but my wife bought it, and so it reminds me of my wife. So I think it's worth a lot. I don't know how much it costs, but I think it's worth $250. She said, I saw it at IKEA for, I don't know how much. How much would a table like this cost? Yeah, let's say $50. And it's used, and it's stained and scratched, and women notice these things, right? And you keep banging against it. It's probably a bit rickety now. So she said 50, I'll say 250. But I was expecting that she's bought it, so I went and ordered a case for my patient's phone, my Android phone, and I got a replacement, battery, and this and that. I got all these different things, expecting those $250 to come, or if not 250, maybe 200, and we'll fight. But even if we don't dispute, that was sinful. Or if common thing, said, okay, I'll buy this table from you for $50, but I'll pay you later though. Said, okay, done. What's the problem? He didn't say when. And alhamdulillah, this is easier to explain when you're in a place like Canada, because generally, we live in a country where most of the public, at least the public dealings and our professional dealings, things are clear and defined. That's good. You'd be shocked, like in a place like Jordan and elsewhere, and in Syria, when teaching these things, and don't even talk about Pakistan, and other parts of the Muslim world, it is devastatingly difficult to get this through, because people are like, tawakkalna ala Allah, we trust Allah. Or, خلاص مش رايحين نختلف, we're not going to disagree. So, wallahi we will. It's my right to disagree with you. Right? Because my rights go contrary to your rights in this. نحن إخوة, so we're brothers. So yeah, let's stay that way. Right? Something like you have to pick a fight. Just, someone comes to fix your toilet. They're going to charge. They're working 3 hours. It's not just for. Say no, مش رايحين. And but then afterwards there'll be a fight, and it'll become really dramatic. So some places this is really bad, but sometimes we carry over those bad habits. We have these residual bad habits in our community. So Muslims get into something they won't define, and as a result, dispute, if it doesn't arise, means the people are foolish. They don't know their best interests. Right? Either they're foolish or they're really magnanimous, and you shouldn't expect folly nor excellence day to day. this also applies as a principle to non-material transactions. There should be clarity and definition. It happens with volunteers in non-profits. Say, can you help out a little bit? And say, okay, here's marketing. Can you do all of it? And they didn't agree to any of that. And they agreed they'll help out a little bit. And that's a type of injustice as well. It's not a material injustice, but it is also injustice. You're taking of another's time without their agreement. But it should be on both ways. So if you volunteer, you should be clear on what you can and cannot do, and how much you can volunteer. And the one placing a demand should also have that discipline about being, not burdening people more than their limit. And then the verse continues talking about let there be a scribe who records the details of the transaction justly. Right? So there's certain things that are trusts, and such as being, in the old days, being a scribe, right, between two parties. Like now we have notary publics and lawyers, and these are professions that are trusts. And when there's trusts, given the emphasis in the Qur'an and in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ with respect to the fulfillment of trusts, historically in Muslim societies there's great caution in there being a form of accreditation, of certification of people who are in these positions, scribes, even actually, and there were guilds, rather like professional associations, that gathered people of different professions. Because if scribes get a bad name, it's detrimental to the scribes themselves, because people won't pay them as well if you're not sure if they can be trusted. And there's a public, so there's the private interest of that group, there's a public interest, and then there's also a religious responsibility. And these guilds are actually a really beautiful part of Muslim society, in that different professions also took care to look at the spiritual aspects of their work. The spiritual aspects of their work, which you see in this verse. Right? Like what does the scribe have to do? That let the scribe not refuse to write as Allah has taught them. And the person who's in debt, let them tell them the terms and have taqwa of Allah their Lord. Right? And there's many other verses that highlight this. Right? There's that professions have an element of trust. Now you have to have a way of inculcating that trust. So guilds used to have covenants that they'd make, that we commit to do this, and this, right? As a part of the spiritual aspect. And some of them were really beautiful, right? Of weavers, for example, committing that as we weave, we'll weave, striving to make dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, etc. So that, because even all these different things, they're a trust. Like you make pots, it's a trust, because people put things in it. If the pots break, it's a breach of trust. And there's a lot of good practices in historical. There's a beautiful book for those of you who know Arabic, or if you ever see it come out in English, look for it. I think one of the great Kattanis, Shaykh Muhammad Ja'far al-Kattani, I believe, because the Kattanis are a big family of hadith masters and fuqaha from North Africa. He has a book called Al-Taratib al-Idariyya. The management and systems, right? Which is basically about how the Prophet ﷺ structured Medinan society and the systems he placed in all different aspects of life, and how these were derived from Quranic principles, from specific prophetic teachings, but how those were applied. It's a 2-volume work, and there's many other such works. There's a book by Dr. Mustafa Sibai, who's the founder of Kulliyat al-Sharia in Damascus, And there's some sibais here in Toronto. It's called Hadaratuna, Our Civilization. It's a small book that's actually translated into English about many of these systems that were in place. Right? And that's part of a public responsibility as well, right? That there has to be modes of securing uprightness of those things that are trusts for the well-being of a community. And we have such things in the broader society, and these are very good practice, and we should be very thankful to be in a place where there's these kinds of institutions. But this is a standard which our tradition, the Qur'an, the Sunnah have called us to uphold the highest levels of, right? So that we take the right means to secure rights and avoid dispute. As we've highlighted, there's this repeated call to be mindful of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that taqwa, right? Taqwa is not just a feeling, and it's not just something that has devotional aspects. Taqwa is really tested in your buying and selling. You're fulfilling the rights of others. Sayyidina Umar said, never trust a person until you've done one of three things. You've done three things with them. What are those three things? One is to travel with them. Number two is that you've transacted with them. And there's a third, which you can look up. Because that's the real test of knowing someone, right? And knowing their taqwa. Right? Because people have multiple aptitudes. Someone could have been working hard at getting their worship right, working hard at dealing with their character. But when it comes to the rights of others, particularly material rights, work, they just go to work because I have to. As long as I don't get fired, I'm fine. Right? So one needs to be careful, and that's a question, right? To be mindful of Allah across the different aspects of one's life. So one should look regularly. The believer reflects on where they're at in life and what they're doing, and one should look at the various aspects of one's life. My work, my relationships, family, friends, my responsibilities, to my parents, to my wife, to my husband, to my children, what other commitments I have. Am I upholding taqwa in these matters? Or am I striving for excellence in these matters? And so that should be a constant question. And then when unsure, how do I have taqwa in these matters? What does one need? One needs that relevant knowledge. Because the knowledge we seek is the knowledge that enables us to, number one, be in a state of submission to Allah in the circumstances of our life. And number two, that enables us to seek Allah, to seek Allah's good pleasure, to have excellence, to strive to uphold the sunnah in what we're doing. Sometimes we sit and read all kinds of interesting things. This is the 5th book I'm reading on purification of the heart. But what about purification of your own life? Okay? Because it feels good to say, oh wow, that's so amazing. The way Ibn al-Qayyim talked about gratitude, amazing. But you never take it from there and apply it to your life. What about my gratitude to my parents? Mom's so annoying, right? So who cares what Ibn al-Qayyim said about gratitude if it isn't there in your life? Gratitude about one's work, right? People typically come, I have to get to work, I have to do this, I have to do that, right? And part of taqwa relates not just to outward actions, but to attitude, right? And one of the things that goes against taqwa in attitude is complaining. Imam Ghazali has a very scary, we posted it recently on Seeker's Guidance, because one of the pillars of faith is to believe in destiny, that both is good and is pleasing and displeasing are from Allah. So he has this really scary passage, and Sheikh Nuh Keller translated in the Reliance, and one of the brothers on the Seekers team from New Zealand, Sidi Asif Sacha, posted, it's like a paragraph extract of the things that go against contentment with fate, with destiny. And it's scary. Basically, don't complain. It's simple as that. But when you're complaining, who you're complaining against? The one who made things this way. People complain, about the weather. In winter it's cold, summer it's humid, other times of the year it's raining. Always complaining. Okay? Whereas, who made the weather that way? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, we should, and that's part of taqwa, right? That it's not just that we not do things that are displeasing to Allah, but we not have an attitude that's displeasing to Allah. And there's a call then to witnesses, right? That seek to appoint 2 upright witnesses amongst you. And this is recommended in significant transactions. Let's say it wasn't so dramatically urgent for Zubair to borrow the $10,000 from Auntie Huda, but that's a significant amount. And then things could, all kinds of differences could arise. Auntie Huda is actually from the States, and Zubair's in Canada. So Auntie Huda might remember that it's US dollars. He might remember that it's Canadian. And how do you repay? And so having witnesses also helps, right? Because even if certain things may not have been recorded, the witnesses there are there to confirm the transaction. A common mistake that happens with witnesses is that, especially because a lot of private transactions are sensitive. So they'll appoint witnesses who are ineligible witnesses. Imagine if Sidi Amr let's say Sister Yasmin, decide to start her own business, so she's borrowing $100,000 from Umar Jafar. So Sidi Amr, Yasmin's husband, is one of the witnesses. And Umar Jafar's business partner is the other witness. So we have 2 witnesses. What's the problem? These are interested parties. A spouse is considered an interested party. A business partner is considered an interested party. No court of law would admit such a witness. It can't be people who are immediate, a spouse, immediate family, or someone you're in business with. Imagine, Nader wants to fund his an album 10 years from now, and he appoints his son Mustafa as one of the witnesses. That's absurd. And Mustafa is trying to get through college at that time, and he needs the money, right? So which is why it's both very difficult to do things right without knowledge, and it can be overwhelming to do things right. And the deen both facilitates, gives clarity, and it's actually, inevitably, it's much easier than you imagine. Someone sent me, I felt really sad, 2.5-page email about how 6 of their fasts so far have been invalidated. Because they keep having to make ghusl, and the ghusl keeps being invalidated because they sniff water up their nose, and it goes from the soft part of the nose to the hard part of the nose. So their fast is broken for the day. And they're devastated, and they're down. The Prophet ﷺ said the cure for confusion is just to ask. And it's a good inclination that we have when we're trying to practice our deen. That inevitably, we're trying to be careful, but caution is not possible without knowledge. It will result either in confusion, being overwhelmed, being excessive, and of course none of the guys' fasts were broken, because it's only if the water goes into your body cavity, which is kind of hard to do, and you'll feel it, trust me. It's not comfortable to sniff water up your nose. People don't normally do that. Otherwise people would drink soda from their nose, right? If water goes up, you'll feel it, typically. So ask. And that's one of the aspects of being excessively self-reliant that people just don't. And it's just to their disadvantage. And sometimes it's not even a question of asking a sheikh. Just ask a religious friend. Have you read something about this before? Right? And there's many practical applications to these principles of clarity and definition. The early Muslims used to say, with respect to friends and family, he said, be brethren, but transact as if strangers. That the most important situations in which you have to be cautious, because those are the relationships that are most significant, is friends and family. One, because the consequence of there being a dispute within family, within friends, is worse than with a stranger. But secondly, non-definition is much more likely amongst friends and family. And disputes happen all the time. Right? I don't know how much you've witnessed this, but financial matters related to who owns what, who owes what, who does this belong to, who gave this to whom, lead to all kinds of problems within family, amongst friends. So one should define things clearly. Like when you borrow and lend things, keep track of them. A good practice is that, for example, even food. A number of times I've seen people like curse or come close to cursing about someone took my beep 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 bowl. Because, people are attached to things. It's their right. It belongs to them. So you gave salad to someone in a bowl and now you can't find that bowl. And it was given to you by someone dear to you or whatever. It was a wedding present. So what should you do? One thing is that things that don't need to be handed over, don't. So for example, if you take food for someone, if you care about the containers, have it emptied out, take the containers back before you leave, because container recovery is annoying. You take the means to facilitate easy return, both for the one giving and the one taking. So the one taking, for example, if you borrow books, a good practice I've seen from Shaykh Faraz Rabbani, he used to keep any borrowed books. He had a special place allocated where just borrowed books, right? And that's where he'd keep borrowed books. And if you're a student of knowledge, inevitably, there's books that you're reading that you borrowed from someone to research, etc. So he'd keep them separate from his other books. Write things down. Right? Write things down. That okay, so and so borrowed this book, and when is it due? So just take it in writing. And if you make it a habit, if you print it out, for example, or you send them a copy that borrowed on this date, due on such and such date. Make a calendar reminder for yourself that this book I borrowed it, it's due on such and such date. Send them a reminder a few days early, a week early, that by the way, that book's due, and are you able to return it then, or do you need some more time? Or I'll be needing it back because 1, 2, 3. Right? And one does so tactfully, gracefully, gently, but these are from good practice, and they avoid dispute, they avoid loss. This Roman Catholic minister that I used to work with, Reverend Peter Benson, he used to have a sticker. When he lent a book, it was a removable sticker. It says, this book was stolen from Reverend Peter Benson. You just stick it in the book. Okay. He also had another thing that said, small is the raven, gray is the rook, great is the sinner who steals his book, or something like that. I don't know what color a rook is. What color is a rook? I actually don't even know what a rook is. It's some kind of bird. But all kinds of problems happen from it. So we see in this verse some of these principles. One of the areas within family that one should be careful about is things that are given. Things that are given. So let's say that whole marriage thing didn't work out because Auntie Huda was actually on vacation. So Zubair didn't find the $10,000. But Bilal found out that they were considering her to marry someone else. So Bilal backed out of the marriage. As a result of all that, Zubaydah said, I give up. I'm going to marry the first person who proposes to me, and Dad, you better accept. So, and they're Hyderabadi, of course, and this Sudanese brother comes and he proposes. So Uncle Jamil said, how dare you consider a proposal? Now that's racist, whatever, but it is what it is. So what does Uncle Jamil do? First thing he does, he says, Zubaydah, give me the car back. Zubaydah says, Dad, but you gave me the car. He said, I didn't give you the car. I lent it to you. He said, no, you said I give it to you. I said, I give it to you as to use, not to keep. It's in my name. He says, but I customized the car. It was a BMW, but I made it more feminine. He says, you can do it, whatever you want inside, but the BMW is mine. And they have a dispute, which makes the whole other drama even worse. Now, it's not easy in family, etc., to make things clear like that, but it is very possible and it's very important. Because the nature of people is they're needy, and when they feel threatened, immediately what they do, they try to grasp on to things that are theirs. Right? So or let's say the loan worked out, Zubayr and Zubaydah got married, Zubaydah staying at her apartment downtown. But who bought the apartment? Uncle Jamil. Right? And again, some disagreement happens, says, give me back the apartment. Find your own place. Says, but you gave it to us. Says, I let you stay there. Says, am I mad? I'll give people like you $1 million condominium? Right? And it leads to, and it's not that difficult to do things right. You don't have to do it on the spot. The uncle's giving a big hug, Zubaydah, you can take the apartment. Says, Dad, can you, before you hug me, could you write it down? You don't have to do it that formally, right? But you thank, etc. But then said, just for the purpose of clarity, just for the sake of paperwork, etc. Could I register it? I need to register it in my name, etc. So you clarify things, because other things happen. Uncle Jamil will one day die. If it's in his name, the other siblings, $1 million home split amongst several siblings is a lot of money. The other siblings are younger than Zubaydah. They'll want a share of it because they're trying to get established. Someone's trying to pay for college. Someone has debts to clear. I said, why did you get the apartment anyways? Right? So, but Zubaydah, I'm living there. Why are you guys being unreasonable? Right? My husband's is back in university, etc. You really want us to move out? And we've planned, and it will break a family apart. So it's very, very important, right, that in family things that are given, don't just go on assumptions. Whose house is it? Even in marriage, who owns what is very significant Islamically. Because here in Canada, for example, we have common property law. But Muslims, when tested, if the husband's the primary earner, what would the husband argue? Who do things belong to? To him. He said, I paid for it. What will the wife say? No, common property law. And she'll make an Islamic case for it. Said that this is the law of the land, and when you married me, you didn't agree otherwise. Actually, several times I've asked sisters, have you studied Islamic law? So why? Because they came up with a brilliant legal argument. I've discussed the issue with fuqaha, and we've discussed, well, what is the answer on this issue? I don't know the answer, it's a new issue. But the best argument made for it has been made by sisters who are on the verge of divorce and saying, I'm demanding all of this. And why? Because Islamically, this. It would embarrass some of the fuqaha who are making much worse arguments. But what does one need to do? One needs to define things. You want to go with common property law? Agree to it. Agree to it in writing. Okay? You should have a marriage agreement on these significant matters. If you don't agree to that, you say, okay, what's mine is mine, what's yours is yours. Zubaydah, from a wealthy family, Zubair is in. She's got a house, she's got a car, she's got accumulated wealth, etc. She doesn't want to share it with Zubair. So She can say, what's mine is mine. Or you could agree to anything, that what's mine is mine, and what's yours is ours. Right? You could agree to pretty much anything. The same thing if you enter into transactions between Muslims. You start a business, you hire someone, etc. The first thing is follow established practices. Follow standards and best practice. There's standards for everything. And in most things, if you follow established standards, you just use a standard contract, etc., try to follow best practices and find out with that what are the Islamic considerations, then you'll be safe. Then you'll be safe. If you don't, then it's not, the fault isn't you can't trust Muslims, that you didn't transact in a sound manner. You didn't transact in a sound manner. And now a lot of this stuff is readily available. Sample contracts, etc., are readily available. But the final aspect that's highlighted in the verse is there's a need for knowledge. And that the deen has come for a clear purpose, which is to preserve human interest. جلب المصالح ودرء المفاسد. The attainment of human interest and the prevention of harm from humans. But how that human interest is preserved, how good is preserved, you're not born with that knowledge. Right? And if you don't learn, it's almost inevitable that you will follow, that you'll fall into the haram. Which is why Imam Suyuti has this very powerful statement that he said, "Man radiya an ya'mala bil jahl, faqad radiya an ya'si Allah ta'ala." Whoever is content to act without knowledge is content to disobey Allah Most High. And this is very clear, for example, from the hadith of the halal and the haram, that the lawful is clear and the unlawful is clear. Between them are unclear matters that most don't know about. So whoever avoids the unclear safeguards their religion and their honor. But whoever falls into the unclear has fallen into the haram. Because it's inevitable. If there's even a 10% chance of it being haram, if you keep repeating it, at least sometimes you'll have fallen into the haram, if you don't know whether it's halal or haram. And what's the consequence of that? The consequence of that is spiritual, as is clear from the hadith of the halal and haram, that in the body there's a morsel of flesh. If sound, the whole body is sound. If corrupted, the whole body is corrupted. What corrupts the heart is the kinds of choices you make. And here as well, the verse here on debt closes with a reminder, وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهِ, and have taqwa of Allah. Right? Which is that do nothing, have no attitude, nor action, nor response, except that you're sure that this is acceptable to Allah, or that it is pleasing to Allah, or that it is beloved to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَيُعَلِّمُكُمُ اللَّهِ. And if you have that concern, then Allah will teach you. Allah will give you the knowledge, the guidance that will show you the way to Him subhanahu wa ta'ala. But it's critical that one seek the knowledge of these matters. Otherwise, one is in danger, and one is in danger of falling into a lot of wrong. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for facilitation and ease in that. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Before we close, any questions? Go ahead.
So, you mentioned employment contracts, and obviously we spend most of our time at work, 40, 60, 80 hours a week. So, mashallah, you put it very well. A lot of people are working just not to get fired, right?
Yeah.
Or whatever standard is that they're judged on based on their performance. And the Muslim is supposed to be striving for excellence, but that doesn't necessarily translate in matters of work. To do that maybe extra bit that would only achieve so much more in a career or in a job or so on, just to do enough to meet quota and so on. So I guess, how is it that the Muslim balances striving for excellence, but the reality is for many of us who work just enough not to.
Yeah. So how does one have excellence at work when the excellence can be testing? There's a few things, right? That in ihsan is not doing more, number one, right? Ihsan is not just quantitative, it's qualitative, number one. Number two, ihsan is about an excellent balance in one's life. Right? It's not someone says, I'm good to my wife. I spend all my time with her and I don't do anything else. So you don't show up on time to work, you leave early, you don't visit your parents, you don't keep in touch with any friends, you no longer help anyone in the community, and several projects were dependent on you. That's not ihsan. That's imbalance. Right? And it's actually not good even, it could be very suffocating if you never leave your wife alone. Right? So the Prophet ﷺ gave us a beautiful principle. He said, أَعْطِ كُلَّ ذِي حَقٍّ حَقَّهُ. Give everyone who has a right their due right. Right? And then one fulfills that right in a good way. Right? In a good way such that it doesn't lead to imbalance with the other rights. Sometimes with certain things it may require stepping back. I remember when I was at university, and those days, startup culture wasn't as it is right now. This is, mid-90s, before the big tech boom. He was right at the beginning of the tech boom. He was 94, good friend of mine, got hired from end of second year biology to work for an IT company. And he was making easily $200,000 a year for 2 years. Right? Probably more than that. But he was putting in crazy hours. The third year, beginning of the third year at work, we were just hanging out one day. Said, I have really good news. Said what? Said, I took $150,000 pay cut. He took like a $70,000 job. So I forget the exact numbers, but it's a huge pay cut from how much he was making. But it was reasonable hours. But the other job was basically, they're looking for, young people with a lot of energy who could basically live at work. He's putting in 16, 17, 18-hour days, sometimes 7 days a week. Okay? So their excellence wouldn't be to do even more than they demand. Right? Sometimes the right balance is that one withdraw, that some things are not reasonable, given the other considerations of balance in one's life. But also within reasonable work, it's a question of acting with excellence, right? Which is to do things better. Part of that excellence may not necessarily be simply output related. Some of the excellence could be in your attitude at work, in your conduct and character at work. Right? That's part of excellence. In your having a excellence in your intention. That whatever you're working in some research lab, but presumably they're not making poisons to kill human beings. It has some direct or indirect benefit. Someone emailed me a really strange question, so I Googled them. Who is this person? And it took me to their master's dissertation. It's like, I didn't know it was their master's. I just wanted to know who it is, because that's a really complicated question. So sometimes it helps to know who is this person. And it was some molecular something or the other. I didn't even understand what it was about. So I just said, okay, forget this. But so anything you're doing is of actual or potential benefit to others. You work with a good intention. Right? Excellence, there's spiritual excellence at work, that you keep your tongue moist on dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? You uphold good character. Right? You make the most of your time at work. Because in any work situation, there's intense work and then there's passive moments at work. You're waiting for a meeting. What do? Just having ihsan there is that you direct that to the good. Whether it be spiritual good, you make dhikr, you recite Qur'an, you go pray 2 rak'ahs, come back, or social good. You use that time for some of the some of the volunteering that you do. You have some extra time, you catch up on your Seekers Hub email, or maintaining family ties. You call, so you have retired uncles and aunts, whatever, you call them up. Right? So you have a sense of urgency to use your time in excellence. But sometimes it may entail disengaging. I won't mention who it is, but a number of the leading Muslim activists, who really established the institutions here in North America. One thing we have to admire about that generation is that the people who built our institutions in North America did it largely on a volunteer capacity. They gave of their time and their life on a purely volunteer basis. You wouldn't believe that. If you see the amount of output they had, the amount of masajid and organizations that they set up, they were part of, that they're instrumental in. But this was while working full time. And they've stuck with it. Those people who established the Muslim Student Association, for example, in the early 60s. Those who haven't passed away, pretty much every single one of them is still active. That's a testament to their sincerity. Hafidhahumullah ta'ala wa rahimah. But a number of them, and I know a number of them, brilliant individuals, but they didn't progress very much in their career. They got their PhD in whatever they got their PhD in. Now they're past the age of, they're well in, they're retired, but they retired not with a full professorship yet. They're still just an assistant professor, an associate professor. Why? Because they kept the work. They were loved as teachers, admired as teachers, they were mentored as teachers, etc. But they didn't further their career very actively because their priority of excellence was elsewhere. Right? They were doing their job, they're doing it well, but that wasn't their focus. Their focus was to serve elsewhere with excellence. But still, the elements of excellence are still manifest at work. They did what was due upon them. They did it well. They upheld good character there. They admired. So that's part of it. It's not everyone has success. Is not necessarily you have to be very successful in your career. I mentioned yesterday Hajj Kamal, this Bedouin. The local Jordan is largely Palestinian, 75% Palestinian, 25% local Jordanians. And the Jordanians were largely Bedouin. Most of them were moved into the cities. They weren't city dwellers. So Hajj Kamal too, Bedouin. He is actually born in a cave in Amman. I've actually been in the cave, the coolest thing, because Amman's built around hills, and the shoddy buildings, that the buildings in winter, if not carefully heated, will be colder inside than it is outside. It's like a refrigeration system. It's amazing. And I experienced it. So he was actually born in a cave, a 25-foot cave outside their house. So they had a house, but in the winter they'd stay in a cave. And he was actually born in that cave. So his family have a lot of land holdings, etc. And so they're in construction. But Hajj Kamal works only till Dhuhr. He's probably retired now, but work just till Dhuhr. That's it. So he had a cell phone for work, and you could catch him till the adhan of Dhuhr. After that, he'd go have lunch with his parents because they're very elderly. And then he'd go home, rest, spend time with the family, engage in evening worship, attend some gathering, etc. Spend time with his wife, go to sleep early, then it's time for ibadah. So, and he start, sometime after sunrise, normal work day, start at 8 o'clock, 8 till Dhuhr, that's it. He said, I could make a lot of money. He said, we have land, we have connections, we have this. He said, I've put all my kids through university, I spend time with them, I give them, right? So excellence is not necessarily that you become the biggest construction company in the world. Excellence is having what you're trying to maximize is benefit. The variable that the believer is trying to maximize is not wealth, nor status, nor power, nor influence. It is to maximize the khair, the good. And where that mix of good would be would depend on one's circumstances. It would depend on one's circumstances and opportunities. And sometimes it is that one's working in something just to sustain oneself, and one's engagement is in another matter. And it's not a condition for worldly success that you be wealthy. And some of the smartest people, there was this really elderly man. He looked like a light bulb with a white beard, right? In Damascus. He was in the Suq al-Jazmatiyah, this old market in Maidan. And the guy just had a small kiosk selling like candy and stuff. But he had a stool. He was easily in his 70s. He'd be sitting there even when he was at the kiosk, he'd be reciting Qur'an or making dhikr, reading Dala'il al-Khairat. Okay? And he used to sell, candy and school supplies. And he'd only be open for a few hours a day. That's it. He had a family home down the road, the simple little place, but he got it from his father, someone in the family. That's it. But what's his life? His life was devotion to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and raising his kids. And alhamdulillah, said, all his, I hadn't seen his kids, but they've all been to university, or one or two of them were scholars or imams, right? So he'd raise his kids successfully, he gives his family their due, etc. He's devoted to the Lord, and he's surviving comfortably. And that's a value that's not, it's alien to many of our thoughts. I have a friend, he's actually featured in the New York Times. It's kind of funny because he thinks photography is haram, but his big flowing beard was in the New York Times. And he was this principal of this really excellent school in England, a vice principal. And he was on track to become the principal. And he was still in his late 20s. It's almost unheard of. But he quit. Said, this is a bit too much. This is not what I'm supposed to do. So he started his own tutoring service. And he put a cap on himself that he wouldn't work more than 15 hours a week. He purchased a council home, which is like government subsidized houses. They're putting them up for sale. So he bought one that was near a masjid. So him and his wife live by the masjid. He works 15 hours a week. He spends time with his, he spends a good amount of time with his wife, has time for his devotion, time for seeking knowledge, time for community service, and he's leading a dignified life. And the guy has a law degree, 2 masters in education, brilliant guy. So I stay with him in his rickety home, but really, they're a really wonderful couple. And I was like, you got such a good tutoring service set up. Why don't you why don't you hire a few other tutors? You got such a good system in place, just for himself. And you could be minting money. You could have this up and down the country. Because the Muslim community has serious need for tutoring, etc. The worst performing community academically in the US, in the UK. He said, why would I do that? I'm getting by comfortably. We're saving a little bit. We live within our means. So this is, but what is he trying to maximize? He's trying to maximize his spiritual works, his seeking knowledge, his community service. And work is a means to that, and he does it well. He's very popular, he gets a lot of demands, but he has 15 hours quota of that he'll work as a tutor, and that's it. Okay? And not that that's ideal. Different people have different balances that they achieve, but the key is to find a balance that maximizes the good in one's life.
So more of a question of clarification. You had said that something that is not defined that could lead to dispute is therefore something that corrupts the transaction and makes it passive. So is there actually anything that if left undefined and definitively not lead to dispute, or is it the case that everything left?
Yeah, in general, if there's in contracts, there's the essence of a contract, which is what is the subject of the transaction. If that's not defined, the contract is null and void. So I'll sell you something for $10. That's absurd. Right? Or you say, I'll sell you an item of men's clothing. Now, it could be anything. It could be my Lionel Messi shirt that I'm wearing, right? But it's hidden, you can't see it, right? Or it could be a thobe or a jubba, so there's the essence of a contract. Then there's the core details, right? Which when the price, when it's due, any key terms and conditions, and then there's details. Some details may be excusable, and those details, they're covered by, you have the option of inspection. When you buy something that you haven't seen, you have a right of inspection, Islamically. The general principle. If you buy something you haven't seen, you have the right to cancel, upon seeing it. So, but those details, because you got an iPad cover, but even if you saw a picture, you can't tell the texture. Now you might be someone who's very tactile and they care about the texture. I got this iPad cover, the wire cutter said it's the best iPad cover, around, but it's annoying because I just don't like the edge, right? But I'm stuck with it. Now, if I really cared about that, I should have refunded it, right? So some things are covered by that. There's some types of non-definition that don't lead to dispute though, like a buffet lunch, for example. Last time you went to a buffet lunch, did you ever see two people fighting over it? I mean, an auntie might have been putting like laddus in her dupatta or something to take home, but that's going against the terms of, but a buffet lunch, for example, the amount you eat is not defined. That's significant normally in restaurants, but here it isn't. Why? Because most people have a de facto limit. Most people can't eat. The real rare exception would be considered overlooked. Right? And usually, actually, if you read it, at least in the US, these are chains that have buffet lunches, they have a right to request someone to leave. And they cover their bases with that kind of stuff. So if there's some non-definition that is clearly established, not just in between us, but in established practice, does not lead to dispute, then that might be excusable. Then that might be excusable. One example is buffet lunches. Another is taxis. Normally, although it depends, like airport taxis, I actually really get happy when I notice these things. Most airport taxis, they have standard fares. They don't use a meter. Certainly at Pearson, the standard taxis there, the amounts due by zone. And why is that? Because the taxi, the meter would often lead to disputes with foreigners. Because if you're in Toronto, if you've used taxis, you can have some idea how much it would add up to. But someone who's coming, let's say, from Guatemala, or coming from South Africa, or they're coming from Algeria, or wherever, they might not be used to the pricing. But there is a non-definition in you getting in a taxi. Although there's a standard by which each kilometer is determined, someone who's coming from overseas, they don't know the distances. And a place like Toronto is so huge, distances are crazy relative to Europe, for example, or elsewhere. So this could lead to dispute. So there's actually, I don't know whether it's the airport's policy or the taxi company, but it's good practice, right? If you're dealing with people who are not from, who are not locals, that you not use the meter, but you have zoned pricing, especially from an airport, and there can also be people cheating other, foreigners, etc. But outside of that, when you get in a taxi, there's a non-definition. Do most of us know how much the price is per meter? No. But it's defined though. It's defined. Right? Actually, usually they have to list it, either on the back seat or somewhere prominently, depending on where you are in the world. There's definition of the rates per kilometer, per time, stopping, any surcharges, they all have to be defined. So even if you didn't notice that, but it is in itself defined. So that's a non-definition that wouldn't lead to dispute. When you go to a restaurant, do you always look at the prices? No. Well, some people do, but not all people do. So that's a non-definition. You ordered the strip sirloin steak from Affy's. You didn't know how much it was. You felt lazy. You didn't even look at the menu. So I'd like your whatever steak. I said sure. So would you like a pina colada with that? Sure. You didn't look at the price. So is there a problem? Yes, there is. But that problem is not fundamental. Why? Because that's a problem that does not lead to dispute. Why? Based on established practice. What is sufficient for a restaurant to do is to have a menu of prices, to give you the menu. Or even if they have on the wall. They have, in a clearly visible place, they have the prices written. Then if you say, I didn't know it was that much, if you wanted to know, you should have known, because it's right there. So that is considered an inexcusable unawareness. So that's a non-definition that doesn't reasonably lead to dispute, right? Because you'd be considered the negligent party. But there are actually, especially in the U.S. and less in Canada because we don't pay for health care. But in the U.S. it's a big problem with hospitals, for example, that people they have operations stuff. They don't know how much it's going to cost, and whether it will be covered by their insurance or won't be, etc. Okay. I have a friend that he used to be really living it up. He picked me up from the airport in New Jersey, and he was like in bad shape. He was in an accident. He had to pay like $320,000 out of, because his insurance apparently didn't cover accidents of, basically a truck knocked him over when he was on his motorbike, and he was hospitalized for months and all out of pocket. And he just started a new job. Their insurance hadn't activated. The old one was no. It was like big mess. So, but they didn't know that the extended recovery was going to cost that much. Because they said would have just taken him home. They said, well, you've already spent this amount of time in the hospital. And when someone's recovering, the family doesn't normally nickel and dime. I said, okay. So, one should be on one's guard anyways. Sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.